Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Levi Keesecker. I am a natural resource scientist at the Washington Conservation Commission. And thank you for joining us online today for our session on assessing wetland functions and values with applications to the Voluntary Stewardship Program. Super appreciate your time this afternoon. Just a couple logistics before we get started. That the meeting's going to be recorded. It's already, the button's already been pressed, so it's already being recorded. And then we will post this on the Commission's webpage. Usually it happens within a week or so of when we have these events. So if you can't attend the whole session, you can come back and watch the rest later. Please stay muted, or I don't know if you're automatically muted. But I think everyone on here, okay, I guess Jan's saying you're not automatically muted. So please, if you could mute yourself. I think we've all been on these Zoom calls where people forget and it can be kind of distracting. So we're gonna keep everybody muted except for the presenters. And then if you have like a comment or something, just raise your hand or type it in the chat box. And Jan or I will hopefully see that and get to your question or comment when we can. Also, there is I think it's *6 or sometimes *68 for folks who are calling in on the phone. Sometimes sometimes you're muted either on the computer or the phone, or I can't remember how it works, but sometimes you have to press that in order to be unmuted. Ooh, thanks. And Jan's also noting that they'll put this on the CTD website as well. Thank you, Jan, for those links. By way of introduction, so here's the agenda for today. We're at the overview and introductions portion of that. I just sort of introduced myself. I'll just do a quick, little bit more context. So I mentioned I'm a natural resource scientist with the Conservation Commission. I've primarily worked within the Voluntary Stewardship Program, so there's going to be quite a bit of that kind of focus today, but I think the goal is that these tools and approaches can be useful for a variety of practitioners, whether you're in a VSP county or not. And I'm joined by Jan Thomas, who is with the Center for Technical Development, and she's going to be helping with the logistics today and monitoring the chat box and helping us with questions, just help keep things running smoothly. So thank you again, Jan. So the first half of the afternoon, we're going to talk about sort of focus more on the field-based wetlands assessment. So like actually going outside and going to a wetland and thinking about what sorts of information you would collect there to give you some sense of like how healthy is the wetland or how functional is the wetland. Or in VSP, there's a big focus on functions and values of critical areas. So wetlands are one of the critical area types. So the idea being what kind of field assessments can you use to estimate functions of a wetland, for example, and there's different ways to do that. If there's folks on this call who've tried doing this before, you might know that there's a whole bunch of different options for how to do that. Luckily here in Washington, we have some folks who have some pretty great expertise in this area, and we're going to be highlighting that today. Rick Mraz is going to be joining first. Rick Mraz is the wetland policy lead at the Department of Ecology, and he's also a technical panel member in the Voluntary Stewardship Program. So he's going to kind of provide some high-level perspectives on approaches to these field-based wetlands assessments and pros and cons to different approaches. Then we're going to have Rachel Maggi join us. Rachel Maggi is an area biologist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service in Washington, and she knows just insights on different ways that NRCS sort of thinks about some of these issues. And we'll talk a little bit about one of the tools, which is TechNote 14. For using or for conducting on the ground wetlands assessments, and also some other options for thinking about some of these issues. And then we'll have Amy Yahnke join us. She's the senior wetlands scientist for Department of Ecology, and she provides technical support and training for the Washington Wetlands Rating System. So she's going to be talking about that rating system. I can say as someone who took the field training from that wetlands training system, it was really great and super informative and helpful. So looking forward to that. Then we'll take a break, short 10-minute break after that to kind of conclude sort of the field-based portion of today. Then the second half of today, we're going to have Connor Racette, who's been leading Ecology's efforts in the wetlands mapping inventory project. And so he'll be communicating sort of where they're at with that project, what types of different wetlands assessments have folks used across the state, and sort of what's coming next in that domain. And then we are going to have a presentation from Meghan Halabisky, who is a landscape ecologist, conservation biologist, and remote sensing scientist with a background in GIS sciences, environmental policy, and conservation management, who works at the University of Washington's Remote Sensing and Geospatial Analysis Laboratory, talking about some pretty slick remote sensing tools for identifying wetlands at the landscape scale. And then our final presentation today is going to be a joint presentation with Jacob Taylor and Matt Stevenson. Jacob Taylor is a conservation specialist at the Spokane Conservation District and coordinates the Voluntary Stewardship Program at the Spokane Conservation District. And Matt Stevenson is a consultant who specializes in cartography, spatial analysis, web mapping, conservation planning, and GIS project management. He works primarily with government agencies and nonprofits focused on conservation and restoration. So they're going to be talking about applying some of these remote sensing spatial-based tools for looking at some functions of wetlands and then sort of in the context of VSP. So sort of like highlighting some of the tools that are available and then some actual case studies of applications or potential applications of those tools for a certain purpose, which would be reporting and monitoring within the Voluntary Stewardship Program, but also hopefully useful for folks who are in non-VSP counties as well, because I think a lot of these tools are generalizable for a variety of needs. Stopping there real quick, Jan, are there any questions or does anyone have a question before I continue? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that?
Just saying, nothing in the chat right now.
Okay, great. Just kind of FYI, there's more information on the Conservation Commission's VSP website, but here's some of the main contacts for the state agencies who are responsible for administering the Voluntary Stewardship Program, who are often at these sessions and help us as a community sort of absorb these tools and utilize them more effectively for VSP purposes. So before I hand it off to Rick to kind of give us his insights, I just wanted to prime the pump, at least with sort of the VSP flair, because I think all the presentations today relate directly to VSP. So just a reminder to folks on this call that VSP is a voluntary approach to manage critical areas where ag activities are occurring in the watershed, while also maintaining the viability of agriculture. And so as part of this voluntary approach, you have to do monitoring. So the monitoring is not voluntary. The monitoring is required to demonstrate that the voluntary efforts or activities to protect critical areas in a county are actually like working, right? So monitoring is basically like the objective data, third-party data, if you will, to assess like how well is this voluntary approach working, right? And that monitoring has to occur at the watershed scale. That's by statute. So often this is called effectiveness monitoring. This is like how effective are the conservation practices that are being implemented on agricultural lands at protecting or enhancing critical area functions and values. So there's actually 5 critical area types. Today we're going to be focusing on wetlands. Each critical area type has associated functions, and there's actually a list of these functions in the VSP's monitoring guide. I put a subset of them here just to kind of help folks be thinking about, when we're thinking about these assessments, the field-based assessments and the GIS, I think one of the key elements is are there indicators we can use or proxies, or directly through those assessments or through those spatial models, can we get to these functions? Because that's really what the monitoring is supposed to speak to. And then just a reminder that when we talk about protecting or enhancing functions, we're talking about that at the watershed scale. So it's really the sum of all the functions of a critical area over time. So in this case, looking at this map of arrows, the green arrows would be like wetlands where the functions went up, and the red arrows would be like functions where wetlands where the functions went down. You want to kind of sum them all together to figure out overall what's the trajectory of this watershed in response to ag activities. And I think some of the tools that we're going to bring up today, the goal is to provide some tools that can assess changes in quantity of things. So like in this case, sometimes wetlands might get destroyed, or excavator might come and cover them up with dirt. So that would be a reduction in quantity. But another way of looking at it is like maybe you still have the same 10 wetlands in the watershed as you did in 2011, but maybe some of them aren't functioning the way that they were before. So there would be a decrease in quality. So one of the tricks in VSP monitoring is not just changes in quantity, like number of acres of habitat or number of acres of wetlands over time, but also the quality or the functioning of those critical areas. And so that's one of the hopes of the outcomes of the session today, is to demonstrate some of these tools that might be helpful in this regard. And then lastly, what is the purpose of this data, at least within the Voluntary Stewardship Program? One of the purposes is because every 5 years, each VSP county has to submit a report using this effectiveness data to demonstrate that at minimum, the functions and values of critical areas are protected over time. But the other purpose is sort of on the ground, day-to-day adaptive management, so that the VSP work groups, watershed work groups who are making decisions about how to allocate funding and where to target outreach and engagement with producers, and thinking about what kinds of practices you would implement where, so that they have data sort of more or less in real time, and then they use that data to make better decisions or make decisions that are more reflective of the will of the group. I'll stop here for any questions before we hand it off to Rick. All right, here are no questions. Rick, we're going to hand off to you. Let me stop sharing my screen here.
Thanks, Levi. I'm just going to start line. And hopefully all systems are go. No, here we go again. Here's my, we don't need closed captioning.
That looks good.
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining this particular workshop, wetland focused, with respect to the Voluntary Stewardship Program. Ecology is a tech panel member. I am the tech panel member. And Chelsea Benner, whose name you might have seen, is our VSP coordinator. We're active participants and supporters of VSP. And our website has addressed VSP directly in a number of places and provided technical tools. And of course, Ecology, as you may or may not know, has many different programs. And so there's often a great deal of intersect with the work that you all do monitoring water quality with our water quality program. I'm the wetland policy lead, and we have a wetland section at Ecology that has been developing policy guidance and best available science documents in support of the Growth Management Act since its inception. One of our first critical areas ordinance models was 1991, which was the year GMA was enacted. And of course, VSP exists as a part of the Growth Management Act. So it's in that context, I'll talk a little more about wetlands, because wetlands are one of the critical areas in growth management. I think we all know about this part and how it works. Basically, the idea behind growth management is that local governments have to designate and protect critical areas. My purpose in this introduction is to provide a wetland-centric preamble to the rest of the workshop, and to connect some dots between what the statute, aka the Growth Management Act, says, and how it relates to things that you do, like work plans and identifying baselines that were part of your original work plan and may shift in response to adaptive management strategies and monitoring, which Levi touched on. I probably won't go into the pros and cons of various field tools as much as let you experience the presentations by Rachel and Amy and decide if one of those tools may work better for you than another. But will certainly be available for questions and impressions. As Levi talked about, VSP is a non-regulatory approach. The counties opt in to address critical areas where they intersect with agriculture and protect critical areas. It's one of the obligations under VSP while protecting and promoting ag viability. So again, what the Growth Management Act says is the program is designed to protect and enhance critical areas on land use for ag while maintaining ag viability. And it goes into a little bit of length, not much, about what protect means. Protecting or preventing the degradation of functions and values as of the date that the GMA was amended. It gives us a sort of a 2011 starting point, July 22, 2011. And it talks about what enhancement is. It's improving that process, structure, and function existing at that same date. My next slides are going to take a little closer look at wetlands and the concept of this inherent baseline of July of 2011 that's built right into the statute. So remember the statute, it says protect and enhance functions and values, and establishing a baseline was one of the first steps. So think about what was done. What does your work plan say as your baseline for identifying wetlands? Most work plans use the National Wetlands Inventory to identify wetlands, or a combination of NWI, perhaps some hydric soil mappings, maybe local critical areas maps. Many counties have more sophisticated critical area maps than even NWI. But sort of a rhetorical question to be thinking about at this point is, do any of these data sources address protecting wetland functions and values in a way that would allow for a comparative analysis moving forward? We'll talk about that a little more in a minute. So, does NWI capture change? You have 5-year reports, 5-year reporting requirement. NWI, as you all probably know, does not capture change over time, and certainly unless it's been updated. And then in some instances, the updates can be confounding because they may be just more accurate mapping. They may not reflect actual change on the landscape, but they may reflect a different way, more discrete way of mapping wetlands in the landscape. But would change in NWI actually inform the idea about whether you've protected functions and values? Not really. Ongoing HRCD, high resolution change detection, can that answer the question of whether you've protected wetland functions and values? Levi kind of alluded to this and saying you might be able to assert at a core scale, like, yeah, the wetland's gone. Or assert at a core scale, the wetland has different vegetation, or the wetland is still there and appears to be unchanged. But again, those things would not contain the sort of substantive analysis that would say, yeah, we've protected wetland functions and values, or we've enhanced them. And the challenge becomes, what do you do? How does a work group, how does the program evolve if the baseline has the potential to be inherently static? So my aim here is not to create an uneasy paralysis, but instead to point to a direction that may better align with detecting a sorts of meaningful, objectively based conclusions about stasis and change. And really, it's going to be Amy and Rachel's presentations that are going to look more closely at wetland functions and values and offer ways to evaluate them in the context of baseline. So again, just the statutory obligations, protect and enhance. There are challenges with asserting wetland functions and values are being protected at the watershed scale. And Ecology has felt that for a long time that we feel like some level of site scale analysis is an important confirmation. It's a subset of sampling to support assertions. And most work plans already contemplate this. They already have individual stewardship plans or have leaned into the idea of going out and sampling sites. And Amy and Rachel, again, are going to show you some ways to evaluate functions that are useful tools for evaluating wetland function and condition on the sites that you have access to. Enhancement is another thing that's specifically defined in the statute, and it can be really challenging to demonstrate. Plants take time to grow. Work you do, you should figure out you do all this good work, and we know it. We've heard about it during the 5-year reports. It's remarkable the acreages of enhancement that happen. But things like HRCD may not pick that change up. And so once again, doing baseline sampling and continuing monitoring of the work that you do can do that. Amy's going to present on the Washington State Wetland Rating System. It's a method for assessing functions and values. There is a corollary tool to the rating system that may also prove beneficial with respect to enhancement. There's a tool that we've developed that assesses mitigation sites called the credit debit method, and it can look at functional lift over time. Sorry, too fast. So what to do? Again, work plans include site visits as a performance metric. A lot of them do. We feel that some level of site scale analysis is important. It helps support the watershed scale conclusions, and incorporating site assessment tools that have comparative value really help support your assertions that protection and enhancement are happening. And so I'm just going to circle back to comments that were made often in the 5-year reports from the various tech panel members. The use of some of these assessments help connect the monitoring actions to the functions and values being protected. Amy and Rachel are going to present some of the tools that can be helpful in assessing functions and values. The tools are rapid methods and can really prove useful for detecting change in those functions and values. They can help answer the questions about protection and enhancement. That is all I had. It was just sort of a rapid fire description of the overarching perspective that we bring to wetlands when considering voluntary stewardship and considering the work that you all have in front of you as work groups.
Thank you, Rick. Appreciate that context. Very helpful. Does anybody have any questions? I didn't see anything directly related to this in the chat box, but just want to give a second in case anyone has any immediate questions. And just a reminder, we'll have time for open discussion at the end as well. So Rachel Maggi is up next. Hello, Rachel. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, everybody. How do I sound, Levi? Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
I'm going to fumble a little here because here at USDA, we're firm believers in Microsoft Teams. So I always struggle a little bit when I get on Zoom. So let's see if
you're not alone.
All right. Hold on. Let's get this going. Okay. Almost there. Okay. All right.
Yep, that's looking good. That looks great.
All
Rachel.
right. Success. Excellent.
Woohoo! Way to go.
Let me get my other little cheat sheet up here. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rachel Maggi, and I work for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS for short. And next June will be my 30th year here at Washington NRCS. And so I've just been really blessed with a great career here in Washington State agriculture. The breadth of my career has pretty much spanned Western Washington until about 8 years ago when I took on a collateral duty of serving as our state fish biologist. So some of you may have interacted with me east of the mountains looking at beaver habitat restoration and in-stream restoration for salmonids. I will just be honest with my audience today. VSP has been a mystery to me for many years. And a couple of, I think it was last year, I was asked to come up to San Juan Island and give the Conservation District and some of their VSP partners a training on SVAP2, the Stream Visual Assessment Protocol. And, you know, I'm going to jump at any opportunity I can to take a ferry out to the islands. But it wasn't until that training that I finally understood the mission that you all have been given on assessing benchmark and comparing conditions in 5-year increments. And that's a big lift. And so when I was asked to present Biology Tech Note 14, I did a little head scratching trying to figure out why on earth would they want to take this very, very, very simplified tool the NRCS uses in conservation planning and try to extrapolate very detailed functions and values assessments on wetlands. And I hope that I can provide you some opportunity to take this tool and make it your own within your evaluation units. So the first thing I wanted to do today is give you some basics on the tool itself, what it is, where you can find the tool, when to use the tool, and how to use the tool and potentially how to modify it for use at that local scale. And really the goal for me is to give you the information and knowledge on how to make it your own so that it increases consistency. 5 years is a lot can happen in 5 years between the first benchmark evaluation to that next critical check-in point. And I think that definitely some tweaking and brainstorming will be needed at the local level to make this tool your own. So on the right, you see a screenshot of what this looks like. NRCS is kind of still back in the spreadsheet age on this tool. You'll hear Biology Tech Note 14 referred to as our WHAG, W-H-E-G, which stands for a Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide. The most current version of this is dated November 20th, 2015. At that time, NRCS had some updates to the riparian forest section that were made. And you can find this on our Field Office Technical Guide. I'll walk you through how to find this document in just a moment. So it is a spreadsheet that you can download. And you will quickly see when you take a look at Biology Tech Note 14 that it's referring to habitat. I'm going to put habitat in quotes. Habitat a little differently than we were taught in ecology and all of our ology classes that some of us took in school. Wetlands are definitely a type of habitat, but in the NRCS world, we evaluate wildlife use of many agricultural land use types. And so when I say habitat types, for this exercise, these are habitat types that are really different types of agricultural use. We assume here at NRCS that a lot of our wetland systems out there in an ag landscape actually are in active agriculture, which is already kind of a departure from some of the other tools out there that are really looking at benchmark and then how to enhance it and restore it. Our Biology Tech Note 14 was designed primarily to identify opportunities to include wildlife habitat practices in a conservation plan that then a landowner can voluntarily install on their land, either with financial assistance through our alphabet soup of programs or with just technical assistance. So the tool covers a breadth of habitat types that are listed on the screen, from crop systems, which include hay, range and pasture land with grazing animals, upland, woodland, the riparian forest, wetlands, and then also SVAP, or streams, which we have now modified the tool to just basically accept your concluding score from SVAP. So it's not just a tool to assess wetlands. where to find this beast. The NRCS Field Office Technical Guide can be a very, very scary place for those, even within NRCS, to find documents. So I walked through how to find it. The first thing, once you get to Field Office Technical Guide, and I'm realizing now I did not include a link to that in my slide, so I'll pop that in the chat when Amy's talking at you. So you go to section 1. There's 5 sections in our technical guide. Go to section 1 under reference lists, then technical notes by discipline, biology, and then I've circled the actual biology tech note. There's lots of other biology technical notes in here, which range from information on cavity nesting species, wood duck, and a lot of other habitat publications that we've put out over the last 20 years. So when do you use this guide? This guide is very general in nature, and I cannot overemphasize that point. Biology Tech Note 14 was written to span agriculture across Washington State, and Washington State, honestly, is probably we could divide our state up into probably 3 big microcosms of habitat, with the wet side of the mountains here on the Cascades, the central Washington Eastern Cascades, and getting into irrigated agriculture, and then we get into dryland agriculture. So again, when we relate habitat types to active agricultural types, we really have 3 major zones in our state. And so we had to come up with a tool that was general enough for use in all of those environments. It's there to assess general habitat for common wildlife species and groups and assemblages of common species. Do not use Biology Tech Note 14 if you are trying to intensively manage for a single species or a specific priority habitat. So you may be going, well, why on earth are we even going to talk about Tech Note 14 if she's telling me not to use it for wetlands, which is a specific priority habitat type? That's why at the end of this, I'm going to kind of leave it in your hands to add detail to what's already in here to make it usable for this particular aspect. I wanted to show you briefly, let's see if I can get this to work, just a quick anatomy of this tool. I can't see you, Levi or Jan, but can someone confirm that they can see the spreadsheet on the screen now?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, great.
Looks good.
Okay, great. Thanks, guys. All right, so just a really quick anatomy of this thing for those of you who have never seen it. It's in basic spreadsheet format where we have a bunch of worksheets or tabs at the bottom. All of these different habitat types that I referred to in slide 2 are across the bottom. So I'm just going to go over here to the wetland slide. And you will notice that we have kind of a book format of the layout here. But the wetland specific evaluation is literally 3 questions long. It's very short and sweet, which is one of the appealing characteristics of the NRCS tool. The reason that it's so brief is that our planners are assessing habitat across a variety of land uses when they're writing a conservation plan. And we, in addition to assessing habitat for terrestrial and aquatic species, are charged with identifying resource concerns, soils, air, water, plants, and livestock resource concerns. And we add energy and humans into the picture just to really create a very complex analysis. And so as biologists, we had to make this short and sweet. And that's what this tool is. It's very short and sweet. We're going to revisit each of those 3 habitat evaluation criteria in just a moment. But to finish out what you do with this tool, you basically put in the present or benchmark condition in your world using the scores that are laid out in each of the sections. It is very, very fine and acceptable to interpolate and score between. So for example, in this one with water regime, if I felt like we still had some semblance of hydrology left on the site, I could put 1.2 if I wanted to. I could score it a 2. And so you can start to see that some well, maybe not yet. You will see that some site-specific adaptation is probably a good idea to make this repeatable and consistent. A couple of other words of note. Wetland, and it says PC equals 70%. PC stands for planning criteria. The more up-to-date term would be resource concern threshold. But basically here in Washington State, we have acknowledged that our wetlands and stream systems, any of our aquatic systems, are really critical and important habitats. And so we expect that we're looking for a target threshold of 70% out of 100 to be able to say that the habitat is functioning on its own. It's functioning well enough to provide fish and wildlife habitat. That compares to, at the national NRCS planning criteria level, they expect only 50% across the habitat spectrum. So Washington State's a little different, and we expect a little bit more out of our aquatic habitats. So you go through and you populate the top box under present condition. This planned A and planned B probably doesn't relate a lot to your work, but it's an opportunity for planners who have been discussing various conservation practices or beneficial activities to enhance the habitat type. It's a chance for us to extrapolate what we think the change will look like post-implementation of practices. So that's what those are. We have a couple of different categories because in the past, NRCSs, we've offered landowners multiple alternatives. So it's a way to get two different future potential increases in score. Could you use this in your work? I think it's possible as far as using planned A and B, but it's going to take a little bit more thought and explanation at the local level and how to fill those out. So for today, I'm just focusing on the present condition. And then all the way at the very end of this document, there's something called an evaluation summary. Okay, so this example that I have filled in is probably way more complex than any one agricultural operation is going to be in Washington State, but it's just for demonstration purposes. Our planners are evaluating all of the habitat across the ag scale of the site that they're working on. And when they fill in those boxes, they get a corresponding percentage of that out of the total 100 points possible. What percentage are they getting for each of the elements? So let's go down to wetlands for a second here. So here's our three different categories: water regime, plant diversity, and grazing. And if you identify something that's below that 70% target, it's going to give you the score based on the number that you add, and it's going to say below planning criteria. And so it's just a kind of a nice, neat, tidy place to see the summary. But we, with 3 questions, you could take the math and make it much more simple and take the questions that we have, add that to a different format, a Word document, something that's easy to calculate out in the field. This is based on coming back to the office and entering your data and getting a score. I don't think it needs to be that complex if you're just using TechNote 14 to assess wetlands alone. I think that you can add the scoring into your own worksheet, and that would be perfectly acceptable. All right, so we'll get rid of that. So that's really the anatomy of this tool. That's what it looks like and how to kind of operate through it. So let's get into these 3 evaluation categories a little bit more in depth. So we're going to start with water regime. Maybe. There we go. Water regime, which in our world as wetland evaluators, we're really talking about hydrology. And NRCS in our world, we evaluate changes in hydrology that relate to traditionally, commonly encountered drainage activities in an ag landscape. So we're talking about surface ditches, water diversions, with surface water withdrawals, drain tile here in Western Washington, very, very common, berms that cut off wetlands from stream systems. Those are examples of hydrology alterations that we would be looking for. But you can see quickly that these terms are not defined. Okay, so looking at a score of 3 in your wetland, that's a situation where the natural surface or subsurface flow patterns have been altered by some of those things I just mentioned, but the hydrology is still functioning on its own. Well, that leaves us open for a lot of interpretation. And so I think some potential opportunities for local adaptation can be defined disturbance in your county. What are the types of common hydrology disturbances that occur in wetlands across your county and in your watersheds? Maybe it's multiple counties. I'm not exactly sure how it works, but within your evaluation work group area, what are the common types of disturbance? And I kind of feel like a companion guide to Biology Tech Note 14 would be really, really helpful. And then how do you decide if the hydrology is functioning on its own? That's where the repeatability of this tool becomes really, really difficult. You can get a one moment in time assessment of it, but how do you then compare it to 5 years down the road, especially if it's a different evaluator? Okay, let's go to the next one. The next question is plant diversity. This evaluation element really is focusing in on plant diversity and a little bit on structure. But our state biologist that helped me develop this back when I was a baby biologist in 1995 was from Illinois. And so a wetland to our biologist at that time was really a cattail marsh. That's what this thing is built around. And almost 30 years later, working for NRCS, I understand greatly that we have a whole lot more diversity of wetland types within Washington state. And so one of the things that I think is key to using this is you as a work group or a subgroup can define what typical plant communities or wetland types are in your county. Going beyond if it's just a freshwater emergent or a freshwater scrub shrub or freshwater forested wetland, let's talk about what are those actual plant communities like. And I think others on the panel will have a whole lot more expertise in references to help you along the way. I know Ecology's got some great keys to freshwater wetlands of Western Washington, but there's guides out there that can help you. One of these questions is really the word invasive species actually isn't in any of these evaluation questions. However, in an ag landscape, we see a lot of grazed wetlands, okay? And so in the NRCS world, we're pretty happy if we have multiple species within the community type, especially if it's an actively farmed or grazed wetland. But you may want your local work group to differentiate how you're going to handle native versus non-native plants. I think there's there's a lot of room within each of these questions to expand upon them. And then also identifying this term interspersion. Think about, is open water interspersion really a critical part of the wetland system that you're evaluating? I mean, within a forested wetland environment here in Western Washington, we do have certain types of forested wetlands, like, for example, Sitka spruce, lowland bottom wetlands in the lower Columbia and out on the Washington coast that do have periods of seasonal ponding between the hummocks where the conifers are. So you would get some open water interspersion on a very seasonal basis. But again, this tool built to assess all types of wetlands across the entire state. All right. Instead of interspersion, maybe you consider adding other terminology or other assessment terms that help get to the question of what is the composition and structure like within your wetland. Things like looking at age classes, different canopy layers, percent invasive species. There's a lot that you can do to add to more detail into the plant diversity element. The last one is specifically talks about grazing systems, which in our world is one specific type of a threat to wetland function. And I think this is very, very limited. So I think that that your work group could assess what are the other common threats to the wetland in adjacent land uses. You could consider adding additional threats, such as activities in the surrounding area that contribute to sediment, activities in the surrounding the wetland that are contributing to nutrients and pesticide runoff into our wetland systems. And lastly, activities that actively disturb wetland vegetation, such as recreation, cropping, grazing, etc. And I wanted to draw your attention here to where it says evaluate water quality according to the quality criteria outlined in the Field Office Technical Guide. So I wanted to expand on that section for a moment, because I think it's going to give you potential specific tools to add into this last evaluation element, which is really threats. Grazing is just one of those. So one of what NRCS uses to evaluate water quality when it comes to aquatic systems is actually another technical note that this may be the first time a lot of you have ever heard of this one. It's called Washington NRCS Water Quality Tech Note number 1. And it is back to our Field Office Technical Guide. Biology was off the screen. At the bottom, water quality is here, and this is the first one. And there's only a few actually under the water quality discipline. But it's a water quality indicator tools, and you'll see that it was updated in July of 2018, most recently. The purpose and scope of this, I highlighted it, but I also made it bigger for those of us like me who cannot see. This indicator tools can be used to determine water quality problems, set benchmark conditions, which I've heard Rick speak of, the importance of defining those benchmark conditions, guide your inventories, and evaluate and document water quality in the future. When we're starting to talk about evaluations and documentation for future water quality improvements, that sounds a lot like one of the elements of VSP. So I think that looking at how to incorporate Water Quality Tech Note 1 into your process and tying some of these example water quality indicators into that third question relating to threats could be a really, really cool way for you to add some more site specificity to what we already have in Tech Note 14, which can really be seen as an outline of 3 basic elements to look at. So this water quality tech note is a lot of pages long. I don't even know how many. Probably 15 to 20. But it's broken up into 2 main appendices in the back where you can find different tables. Appendix A has tables specifically dealing with pesticide storage, handling, and disposal, nutrient storage and handling, livestock, specifically livestock waste storage. Table 4 is looking at livestock confinement, petroleum, and then table 6, sediment and turbidity. I will show you what one of these looks like in just a moment. Then Appendix B has a subset of a national tool that Washington has tweaked, and it's the NRCS Water Quality Indicators Guide. I think I missed a word. I think it's Surface Water Indicators Guide. And that one specifically is looking at, again, animal waste indicators when you field apply nutrients. And then also when it comes directly out of the back end of the animal while they're out on the pasture or range. And then looking at animals housed in tight spaces, which is a confinement system, either total or partial confinement. So there's a lot of these tables. And basically our planner's job is to fill out and assess the ones that are applicable. If we're not grazing on a site and we're only applying animal waste that's being imported on from a different farm, we wouldn't fill out the grazing tables. This is still fairly small, but you can kind of get the general feel of how to utilize the tool. You basically in different the assessment elements are on the left column, and then as you move across the page, it's looking at blanking on my terminology. Here we go. Management practices. There we are. From highly from the best management all the way to the highest risk of a water quality impairment happening. And so your job is to basically look at what the surface water of the wetland in this case, and evaluate what the risk is based off these evaluation elements. There's a place for you to mark your score. Oops, sorry, too fast. And then at the bottom, there's additional ones that you're looking at. So the top section of this one looks at the wetland itself and what you can see, basically what's running off into your wetland, and then and how it's affecting the wetland. And then part B is looking at the surrounding farm fields, which is really where our threats of sediment and nutrients and organics and fertilizer runoff is happening. Then at the very bottom, it's very, very small. You average your scores together and it gives you an overall risk. So if your score is between 1 and 1.5, you've got a high risk of having a water quality impairment, or back to Tech Note 14, a threat to our wetland. And so hopefully you can see how you might be able to mix and match and pick and choose some of these additional water quality worksheets to help add some more detail to how you assess threats in your wetlands. Oh, here it was. See, I knew you wouldn't be able to see it. So here's a close-up one from the Surface Water Indicators Guide. It's structured in a similar format, except here you basically you circle the appropriate number. You can also score in between, just like those of you who have had my SVEP training. I highly encourage you to, go 5.5 if you can't decide if it's in between, but looking at the list of visual indicators there, and you can score it, and then you add your score up at the bottom, and it gives you an output of poor, fair, good, and excellent. So really, in conclusion, with respect to Biology Tech Note 14, I do not recommend using it for VSP in its current unaltered state. It's not what the tool was built for. But I do think with some customization to your area, it will really improve repeatability and consistency between evaluators. So Levi, that was the end of my presentation. I will take questions or however you guys want to handle that.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Super appreciate that. I think for now, just to keep us on track for time, if you have questions, please put them in the box and we'll address them at the discussion time. But I just want to say thank you very much, Rachel. I super appreciate that. And I think without further ado, we're going to transition to Amy Yahnke with the Department of Ecology, also talking about field-based assessments, but from a different perspective. So Amy, take it away. Thank you.
Great, and just checking, can you see my screen?
Sure can.
Excellent. All right, well, thank you, Levi, for the invitation to talk to you all today about the wetland rating system. Basically, I'm going to give a 10,000-foot view of the rating system. Normally, I teach a 2-day class on how to use it. Levi mentioned attending that before. So I just want to kind of introduce you to it and how it works, and then talk about a little bit of potential applications to VSP. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that a lot of the work that we do at Ecology is actually funded through grants from the Environmental Protection Agency. So they provide a lot of technical assistance and monetary support to states, tribes, local governments, and others for development of wetland programs. And you can get some basic information from EPA about wetland monitoring and assessment at the website that's listed here. They've defined 3 levels of monitoring and assessment. So level 1 is a landscape assessment. That's typically implemented through remote sensing of coarse landscape scale information. The National Wetland Inventory is an example of that. Level 2 is rapid assessment. So that is done at the wetland site scale, and rapid is defined as taking no more than 2 people a half day in the field and no more than a half day of office preparation and data analysis. So these use indicators like plants and hydrology to estimate how well a wetland can perform a function, or to what condition the wetland is in compared to other wetlands of a similar type. The wetland rating system that I'm going to talk about today is a level 2 rapid assessment method. And these are generally validated or calibrated using information from the next level, level 3 intensive site assessments. So level 3 assessments use intensive, research-derived, multi-metric indices that are meant to give detailed information on how well a wetland is functioning or its condition. The wetland rating system was developed out of a need for a more rapid version of a level 3 assessment called the Washington Functional Assessment Method that Ecology developed in the late 90s and early 2000s. So data from that Washington Functional Assessment Method were used to calibrate the rating system. The rating systems are commonly used in the state to help regulate wetlands. They've been around in some form since the early 1990s and have been updated several times in keeping with our mandate to use best available science to protect critical areas. The rating systems were developed to better understand wetland values in a more scientifically valid way, and they allow for a consistent approach across the state to make decisions about protection. There are 2 versions, one that applies in Eastern Washington and one for Western Washington. The division for the versions of the rating system that apply to Western or Eastern Washington is essentially at the Cascade Crest. And the scoring thresholds for ratings were based on those data collected from reference wetlands during that functional assessment method development. The reference wetlands represent a range of functions, so it's not just the highest functioning or the most pristine condition, as is done in other states or other assessment methods. Basically, early on in Washington, we recognized that even wetlands that are disturbed or in less than pristine condition can still provide important functions and values. An annotated version of the rating system for Western Washington was published in July this year, and we'll have one for Eastern Washington by the end of this year, fingers crossed. The annotated version does not change any of the underlying models or the way that we assess wetlands, but it updates the document for accessibility and adds clarifications. In addition to the annotated version of the manual, we created an online application for ratings. It's called the Washington Tool for Online Rating, or WATER. It's designed so that users select an organization, and the program acts like a shared filing system for data within that organization. The tools to create figures are designed to help answer the questions in the rating system. The tools provide a consistent format and design for generating figures, and it's a mapping application that's accessible to users who maybe don't have the technical skills for using GIS, or maybe don't have access to expensive GIS programs. It also serves as an electronic version of the rating form. It's housed in Washington's Secure Access Washington data platform, and there are some nuances to how you sign up for it. So if you're interested in accessing water, please go to our wetland rating system webpage that's listed there and follow the instructions that are posted to get into water. So the objectives of the wetland rating system are to identify wetlands that require different levels of protection, including those where impacts should be avoided. It doesn't assess functions for calculating no net loss, but it could be used to assess change at the site level if it's applied at the same site over time, or at a watershed level if you use an appropriate sampling scheme to be able to detect those changes. So now I want to give you an idea of how the rating system works. Wetland characteristics are rated in terms of their water quality, hydrologic, and habitat functions. Concepts of flood storage and shoreline erosion are included in the questions for rating hydrology. And the rating system is a qualitative assessment model. So it uses indicators to make assumptions about how well a wetland performs these functions relative to other wetlands of the same type. The most recent update to the current rating system model was published in 2014. Scoring for each function was based on a qualitative rating of 3 aspects of function. For site potential, that's the potential of the site to provide the function. So these questions are based on structures like the vegetation and soils on site and how water acts on the site. Landscape potential is the potential of the landscape to maintain each function at the site. This is in response to a greater understanding from the more recent science of the influence of the surrounding landscape on a given habitat patch, like a wetland. And value, the values each function may have for society. So we're looking at the probability the function is performed, rating indicators present on site and in the surrounding landscape. We rate the value to society because our state laws say that we must protect functions and values of wetlands. So we included that piece in the rating. The rating system is structured based on hydrogeomorphic classes of wetlands. So that's a way of classifying wetlands into different groups based on the landscape position, the water source, and how water moves in and through the wetland. When a wetland is rated for water quality and hydrologic functions, a different form is used based on these different hydrogeomorphic classes. For example, if you're rating a depressional wetland, you would use the form with the questions that were designed to address functions and values of depressional wetlands. We use the same form across the hydrogeomorphic types to rate habitat functions. So we do all 3 of the ratings: water quality, hydrology, and habitat. So let's talk about each aspect of function in a bit more detail. So considering the site itself, does it have the structure to provide a function at the site level? So here you can see an example of 2 wetlands in the Olympic National Park. The one on the left is heavily disturbed by elk. So is this a pristine wetland? Well, it's doing a lot of work for water quality because of the concentration of elk in there, but it doesn't have a lot of structure to support other species. The wetland on the right isn't as disturbed by the elk. It maybe doesn't have that level of concentration of animal waste going into it, but it has a lot of structure, and so it can provide a lot of habitat for different species. So these are kind of value judgments, and the rating system tries to kind of tease these things out and apply a more objective view of it. So we're looking for indicators when we're looking at site potential for improving water quality that a wetland is performing a given function for water quality. We know that sediments are carriers of pollutants, and so that's one way that stormwater and surface runoff contribute to poor water quality and contaminated waters. So we look at processes like velocity reduction and sediment trapping that help wetlands to process those pollutants. In rapid assessments, rather than going out and measuring rates of sediment trapping or velocity reduction or the chemical changes that are occurring in the soil, we look at the vegetation structure. Is it sufficient to slow down water and capture sediments? We look at the soil. Is it of a type known to have high cation exchange capacities where those biochemical transformations help to process contaminants? And are there areas in the wetland that dry out later in the summer where you have oxic-anoxic transitions in the soil? Those are also important for processing those contaminants. For hydrologic functions, these are the basic processes for site potential for wetlands. Again, we're looking at processes that slow down water velocity and store water on the landscape. For storage of water, our surrogate indicator is to look at the depth of ponding and the condition of any outlets that might be in the wetland. For habitat function site potential, you could be there at the wrong time of year to detect individual species. So instead of having you go out and survey for wildlife, we look at the different habitat niches that are available on the site. The questions are designed to characterize what niches are present with the assumption that the more habitat niches on the site, the higher the potential to support a greater number of species. So after site potential, we zoom out and look at the landscape. Is the landscape contributing to the wetland's potential to fulfill a function? The wetland on the left has greater habitat potential because it's directly connected to the surrounding landscape, but it's not good for cleaning up pollution because there's no polluted water coming into it. The wetland on the right has poor habitat function because it's cut off from the surrounding landscape, but the hydrologic and water quality functions are supported in the form of velocity reduction and contaminant removal. And there's a lot of extra water and polluted water coming in from that surrounding landscape. So when we rate these wetlands, the one on the right may actually score higher overall because it has a greater potential to perform the water quality and hydrologic functions, but the wetland on the left may score higher for those habitat functions. So just kind of thinking about wetlands at a watershed scale and kind of, why we need to assess things thinking in that broader scale. This is an example of a paper where they looked at wetlands covering the basin. They found they cover 8% of this basin, and they modeled that with that, they can remove up to 13% of the total nitrogen per year. Then they calculated that restoring all of the drained wetlands in this 1.7 million kilometer squared basin could increase the nitrogen removal rates up to 18 to 24%. For flood protection, here's a paper where they compared scenarios of the benefits of agricultural BMPs for flood risk reduction in terms of building and agricultural losses at watershed scales in Iowa. The authors found that the wetland scenario compared to the BMPs for reducing nitrogen and phosphorus, using cover crops, or just the baseline condition, which is your general corn, soybean 2-year rotation, that wetland scenario was most effective at reducing flood loss for all return periods and in all watersheds modeled. And that's shown here on the graph, where the bottom is the wetland scenario and the bars are showing the economic loss. So the wetlands have the lowest economic losses associated with them. And here is a more regional example. This is from Thurston County, where they found that in basins that had total impervious surface areas above 3% in the watershed, the percent cover of wetlands was correlated with stream health when looking at the benthic index of biotic integrity. So just kind of thinking about the importance of wetlands at the watershed scale and why we think about that in that context. And again, we rate the landscape potential because the surrounding landscape has the potential to impact the individual wetlands. So thinking about landscape potential for improving water quality, here we look at the surrounding landscape and how many sources of pollutants are coming into the wetland from that surrounding landscape. The idea here for the rating is that the more sources of pollutants are coming in, the higher the potential that wetland has to support that function. For hydrologic functions, we look at land uses that increase runoff and the relative position of the wetland in the landscape. And for habitat functions, here we look at a 1 kilometer radius from the edge of the wetland. We know that our regulatory buffers alone don't provide a complete or scientifically valid picture of what is needed to protect habitat functions in a wetland. So we need to look at the habitat in the surrounding landscape. How much habitat is available and how accessible is it from the wetland? The value questions ask about the value of the function to society. For example, a wetland that provides flood protection is more valuable. Is flooding occurring downstream? If you fill a wetland upstream, the flood storage is lost. So in these pictures on the left, you can see the Deschutes River flooding over its banks. And on the right is a sign that says Restoring America's Wetlands that was placed in the middle of a wetland that was restored on the Mississippi River that is now doing a lot of work for flood protection. For value, everyone has a different value system. And in forming the rating system, we had to identify what's the value of a function to society. So the ratings are based on values recognized in laws and regulations because it's a tool for use across the state. Without wetlands, the cost to manage impaired waters and the need for flood management increases. Habitat value is personal. We needed a value identified at the state level. So for example, Department of Fish and Wildlife is the final arbiter of habitat value in terms of priority habitats and species. Other values in the VSP world might include the production of natural products. So this is not explicitly rated in this method, but each function bucket includes a place where you can indicate the wetland has been identified as having either water quality, hydrologic, or habitat value by a local jurisdiction or agency. So for a wetland that provides natural products, you might indicate that as having a high value for habitat as determined at the local level. So I mentioned that the ratings are based on qualitative ratings of 3 aspects of each function. With all the different users that are out there, the best agreement that we can come to, the most scientifically valid agreement we can come to, if we're all standing in the middle of a wetland and trying to assess how well it performs, a function like removal of nitrogen, the best agreement we can come to is that it performs it at a high, medium, or low level. But we need numbers in order to use this in a regulatory world. So the application of scores is a policy choice. And the scores in the rating system are just weighted on a 1-point scale rather than doubling or tripling them. The functions in each of the 3 buckets, water quality, hydrology, and habitat, are rated as high, medium, or low for each aspect of potential and value. We don't have enough information to be able to say that a wetland with low function performs some aspect half as well or 3 times as little as one with moderate function. The method results in a final category based on the score for functions or whether they have special characteristics. We categorize wetlands based on their sensitivity to disturbance, the rarity of the wetland type in a region, our ability to replace them through mitigation, whether they're wetlands of significance, for example, if they have rare plants or rare plant communities, and the functions provided by the wetland. That's the rating system that I just talked about. So Category 1 wetlands are those that are especially sensitive or significant, or they rate very high for functions and should be protected at the highest level. Category 4 wetlands have lower levels of functions when compared to other wetlands. They do have functions and they can be important in some areas where those functions are needed, so we don't discount them completely. So how might the rating system be used in the VSP world? Well, you could use it to rate individual sites over time. You could also conduct a statistical sample at a watershed scale where you rate the number that is pretty standard is at least 30 wetlands at a watershed scale, selected using a stratified random sampling throughout the watershed over time. We don't recommend taking the rating system as it is and only using part of it because it is calibrated as a whole within each of those functions. But you could borrow concepts from the method and recalibrate them to meet your needs or use them to refine other methods like TechNote 14. Basically, we've done some heavy lifting to identify indicators of certain functions and processes and what aspects of them are important for driving those. And the scoring in the rating system, again, it's calibrated to that Washington functional assessment method. So you don't want to pull out a question and use those scores just as is. You want to calibrate it to your needs or use each of the functions as a whole. So that is all that I have. And I think I'm a little bit over, but I think we're saving questions to the end. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. That was really great overview, very comprehensive. Appreciate that. We are pretty close to on time. We're about 5 minutes over just from this first half of the session. But I think we have enough. If anybody has any immediate questions on what we just heard, we could take those real quick. And then I would suggest we take our break until 2:25 and come back. So just pausing here for a minute. If there's any burning desires. Not hearing any. So let's come back at 2:25 and we'll start, I believe it's Connor, to talk about the statewide wetlands inventory. So enjoy your 10 minutes of solitude and I'll see you here shortly. All right, everybody. Back, 2:25. I see Connor. Hello. Hope you all had a nice little 10-minute break there. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Connor. Will you be sharing a screen?
Yeah, let me get this up here. All right, how's that looking for everyone?
Ooh, that looks great, Connor.
Perfect. All right, I can take it away, Levi. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, so hi everyone. My name is Connor. I am with the Washington State Department of Ecology. I work with Amy and Rick, who gave us their great presentations earlier. I am the project lead for the statewide wetland mapping inventory project. And this project is being conducted by the Department of Ecology and funded through an EPA wetland program development grant to inventory wetland maps and mapping efforts throughout the state. Really, it is a surface level investigation for us to figure out what wetland data is currently out there and some helpful information about that data. We are looking to find out who is creating data and at what standard, what already available wetland data is being used and how effective it is at meeting the needs of end users, and where there may be gaps in data. Let's see, there we go. So, Ecology connected with voluntary participants from local and tribal governments, state and federal agencies, and other land managers that regulate or manage wetlands. The primary goal of this project was to identify the status and needs of local, regional, and statewide wetland mapping efforts, identify where wetland mapping improvements are needed, and to facilitate communication between users of wetland data, and therefore, in turn, identify potential collaborators for future wetland mapping projects. So first, outreach occurred to create a list of probable participants via active direct outreach and project announcement through Ecology listserv and a variety of other related organizations' mailing lists, which some of you may have received. Next, a survey was developed to better understand two key areas of interest. First, the wetland data needs of all participants, and then for those who create data, or create wetland data, there was a section much more technical in nature, asking some specifics about that data creation and maintenance. Once surveys were completed and returned, a follow-up interview was scheduled to create space to review survey responses together and clarify any questions participants had for me, and vice versa. This also allowed for general discussion on wetland mapping, how wetland mapping is used by a participant, and if they feel their needs are being met or not. The final product of this project will result in an Ecology-hosted webpage of wetland mapping resources, which will comprise of a list of project participants, who to best contact about wetland mapping in their organization or agency, a link to their data if applicable, what kind of wetland data they create if they do create data, and a little bit of info about that data. This webpage is going to be paired with a web map illustrating participant mapping and spatial extents. But this map is going to be a high-level application of data that really only shows the coverage of their data, not specific wetlands. For access to data about specific wetlands and data of that nature, we would ask end users to reach out to participants directly. So to give a better idea of what the status of the project is currently, I have a screen clip here from our wetland mapping resource page that outlines project tasks and their status. As you can see, task 1 through 4 have been completed and task 5 is in progress. So as I mentioned in the last slide, there will soon be a new wetland mapping inventory project webpage that will include a project description, a web map outlining survey participant mapping extents and associated contacts. And then there will also be download links to Excel workbooks that contain project participant contacts, a spreadsheet of created wetland data and related information, and then finally a downloadable PDF of the survey results and summary synthesis. You all can expect to see this webpage live at the beginning of next year, with announcements being circulated related to task 6 in this table. With that being said, I can share some results I have found, which are part of the summary synthesis document. In the initial phase of outreach, I directly reached out to over 300 contacts. This direct outreach was supplemented by a listserv announcements through Ecology mailing lists, Office of the Chief Information Officer, and various other spatial work groups. I received a response of interest from 103 different agencies, tribes, private organizations, and government jurisdictions at various levels. Ecology was successful in getting 60 completed surveys returned and follow-up interviews conducted. The chart here shows the distribution of survey participants and the agencies and organizations that they belong to. We had 33 cities, 12 counties, 6 tribal and 6 state agencies, 2 consulting firms, and 1 federal agency. Overall, we feel confident about the positive response to the project and that the distribution of participants is representative of wetland data users in our state as a whole. And that's kind of discluding consultants that would be in the private section, but we didn't get a whole lot of feedback of interest from them, but we did have some participants, as you can see. So moving on, when we look at the data sets that are currently publicly available and the distribution of participants that use them, the National Wetland Inventory was stated as a data set that was most relied upon by all users. 38 participants, or 60% or 63% of those who took the survey, rely on NWI. And looking a bit more specifically at who is using what data, city jurisdictions were a large percentage of participants, and if they had the capacity, they primarily relied on internal data sets that they create. Or if they did not have the capacity to create data, they relied on data from the county level and NWI to inform their decision-making processes. If a city had a good process for creating their own wetlands data, derived from permit applications, wetland delineations, or other resources, then they tended to rely solely on their internal data sets. Other data sets of note mentioned as being used were the Department of Natural Resources streams data and wetlands of high conservation value data, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife priority habitat and species data, Ecology modeled wetlands and coastal atlas resources, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Coastal Change Analysis Program, that's their CCAP land cover data, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service Soil Survey, the GSERGO data. So when looking at whether participants felt that wetlands data was meeting their needs, excuse me, approximately 63% of participants indicated that their wetlands data needs were not being met. This in turn means that 37% of participants felt that their needs were being met. Looking at the selection of participants who felt that their needs were met, 32% of those that answered yes relied primarily on internal data sets that they created in-house, not needing to reference external data such as NWI. Taking these numbers into account and stepping back again to look at all participants and whether their needs are being met, this means that approximately only 25% of participants in total who do not have the capacity to create their own in-house wetlands data from field delineations, permit reports, etc., felt that the publicly available data was able to meet their needs. So looking more closely at participants who created data, they filled out the wetland data creation section of the survey in addition to the wetland data needs section. This section had technical questions regarding the processes and methods used to create the data, to what standard it was created, and what formats it is in, and how often it is maintained and updated. In total, from all of the participants that indicated that they created wetlands data, there were 61 data sets captured by the survey. The interpretation of what constituted wetland data creation did vary between participants. Some participants indicated that they did create wetlands data, but they really just combined multiple public data sets into a single wetlands data set for easier use, or just queried public data to suit their needs. If we look at data that only specifically creates or models wetlands data outside of basic manipulation of public data sets, then the number of created wetland data sets is reduced to 57. A small portion of participants relied solely on either field verified data, permit data, or some combination of the two sources for data creation. Most participants who created data also used an approach of combining multiple sources, using all the data available to them to try and create the best insight into wetlands in their area. This often meant layers were created that included wetland polygons from permit and field verified data, remotely sensed data interpretation, NWI, and other pre-existing wetlands data. These conglomerate data sets provided a more detailed insight into the potential for wetlands across the landscape. But due to the variety of sources included in the creation of that data, accuracy of individual wetland polygons was variable and dependent on their source. When considering the accuracy and methodology of using field verified and permit related data, not all participants digitized their data in the same way. Some relied on a heads up method of just using visual cues and aids on the landscape to reference or draw a physical map of a wetland location when creating a digital version. Others had a more technical approach to their digitization methodology by scanning in physical copies of wetland delineations and using georeferencing tools to assign the correct location. And this is an important consideration to account for when looking at the wetlands data currently available throughout the state. One measure of quality assurance and metadata consistency is checking whether the data created are compliant with Federal Geographic Data Committee or FGDC guidance. This is a standard set forth from a federal level to maintain consistency on metadata standards for created data. Data such as NWI must meet FGDC standards as well as any mapping project undertaken under federal funding. And with that being said, 47% of participants who created data indicated that they maintain their data to FGDC standards. It is also important to understand that the accessibility of wetland data that are being created. Survey participants were asked if the data they created were available to the public or if the data were private. Of the 61 data sets that were created by participants in total, 57% are publicly available for access to anyone who may be interested. The other 26 data sets were kept private for various reasons, such as the data set was considered incomplete, the data are considered sensitive, and wetland locations did not want to be disclosed, or the data set was considered for internal use only to trigger regulatory actions or investigation into wetland presence. So, conclusions. During interviews, the primary issue stated with the currently available public data is that it is often outdated, inaccurate, and not site-specific enough to the needs of end users. When asked what other types of data would be helpful for wetlands work, it was apparent that most participants were hungry for almost any and all freshly updated high-resolution data. Some specific data sets called for include updated streams data, more up-to-date and accessible high-resolution aerial imagery, especially LiDAR data, high-resolution land use land cover data, and really any type of hydrologic data that is useful at a site-specific scale, such as groundwater mapping, surface water flow, etc. NWI is the most heavily relied upon wetlands dataset. It would be highly beneficial to update the database statewide, as this data is hosted outside of Washington State resources. So after mapping updates, maintenance is the responsibility of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And it's already a definitive, widely recognized, and accessible data set. Furthermore, it became apparent that cities see the most field verified wetlands data through delineation reports, permit reviews, and other regulatory processes. Some cities had the capacity and already have a good method for digitizing their wetlands data and consolidating it into a software such as a GIS. Other cities simply did not have the capacity or resources to do this. Or if they did have the capacity, they did not have the technical know-how to best approach the task. This insight illuminated the need for wetland data digitization guidance and standardization across the state. This would allow for entities to have a document to refer to for accurately and consistently translating new and historic physical wetlands data into digital format. And it would begin to lay the groundwork for the standardization of wetlands data across the state and the potential for consolidation of site-specific wetlands data into a statewide data set in the future. And that may be wishful thinking, but it's a start, right? So where do we go from here? How are we going to use these insights and provide better and more comprehensive resources for you all in the future? Well, firstly, the data and deliverables from this project are on track to be published by the end of this year / beginning of next year. That data will be available for you to reference as a directive resource for who has what wetland data and who to best contact about that data. Second, we at Ecology have submitted 2 new wetland program development grant applications as a direct response to the results of this project. The first grant is going to be for a wetland mapping digitization guidance document. We heard the need for this and we want to deliver. So this document will serve as a consolidated reference, current mapping standards, best management practices for digitizing your wetlands data, as well as also functioning as a quality assurance workbook for any grant applications that may require one for your mapping activities. We hope to include a fillable worksheet with this guidance that would allow you to easily adapt and pull information needed for your grant applications. The second grant proposes wetland intrinsic potential, or WIP for short, modeling statewide at a resolution of 3 to 5 meters. For those of you unfamiliar with this tool, it's your lucky day. Meghan Halabisky will be presenting next and give you a more in-depth explanation of this tool for you all. But in short, this tool was developed by Meghan's lab with support from Ecology and other agencies and organizations to leverage random forest machine learning in combination with multiple topographic, hydrologic, and imagery indices to predict wetland locations with pretty impressive accuracy. It was primarily developed to locate forested wetlands from remotely sensed data, but its applications go beyond just that. Generating and providing this data to you all would provide an up-to-date functional resolution data set derived using the latest modeling capabilities and best available science. This data would also provide an ancillary data set for potential NWI updates in the future. So that's what I've got. Thanks for your time, everyone, and inviting me here to present. Lots of exciting things on the horizon for wetlands and wetlands data. I don't know if we have time for questions or we can save them to the end, but you guys can always reach out to me here at my contact info if you have any questions too.
Hey, thanks, Connor. That was really helpful. And I think you did great on timing, actually almost right back on the time frame. So I don't know if there's any burning desire questions. Again, I think we'll have time at the end for kind of open discussion. But I did want to say, yeah, I think thanks for setting up the wetlands intrinsic potential, folks. Yeah, stick around because there'll be more information on that coming. And I just wanted to, like a little editorial note, I guess. I'm curious about the data that you might be able to direct people to in terms of the historic, like the cities that had done some delineations, sort of the database, I guess, if you will, of wetlands info that you might have. I wonder how helpful that might be for VSP folks who are trying to come up with that baseline data that Rick was talking about from 2011. So there might be some opportunity. Sounds like there might be some opportunities there. It's not going to be like 100% coverage of your wetlands from 2011, right, but it might be useful in terms of triangulating or making some inferences and things like that.
Yeah. I think a great thing that's coming out of this project is the contact list in itself. That's going to be a great place to start for a lot of you to look at regional contacts throughout your area of operation. And then you can start communicating and looking at, what wetland data is available there, how far back does it go? Does it go back to 2011? And you can start consolidating that data and building your baseline.
That sounds great. And hey, real quick, Nicholas Kuntz put in the chat, is Ecology going to utilize this ASPRS imaging, I don't know, positional accuracy standards for digital geospatial data? I don't know if that integrates with the FGDC. That's a little bit beyond my scope of work. Does anyone happen to know offhand the answer to that? If not, we can address it later.
What was the acronym again?
It's ASPRS, Positional Accuracy Standards for Digital Geospatial Data. There's a link in the chat.
Okay. That would probably be a great resource if this next grant gets funded. We can look at integrating that into this mapping digitization guidance, and we can look at how that would be applicable. So yeah, cool. Thanks for posting that. Whoever.
All right, that sounds good. Let's switch to gears to Meghan
Sounds
here,
good.
in the interest of time.
All right. Hi, Levi. Hi, everyone. I'm going to
Stop the sharing. There we go.
share my screen. Here we go. Oops. Ooh, hold on a second.
Adorable.
That's my son a while ago. He's a little older now. Less cute. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly, and I think your screen's in the right mode and everything too. So thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we switched gears a little bit and now are talking about non-field-based tools. And I actually wanted to broaden my presentation a little bit to not only talk about the wetland intrinsic potential tool, but I thought it might be useful to talk more generally about wetland remote sensing and how it can be built into a toolkit for decision making. I thought it might be useful to go over some fundamental concepts in remote sensing for folks who might be less familiar with it. How can it be useful? What are the specific challenges of mapping wetlands using remote sensing? And then I'll dive into the wetland intrinsic potential tool and go into more details about what it is and how it can be applied as kind of a base data set for building a toolkit. I thought it might be kind of interesting and spark some ideas, just kind of reviewing some of the potential applications that I've been working on in my research, either in the past or currently to do wetland mapping, characterizing, and monitoring. So for folks who may be less familiar with remote sensing, it sometimes in less technical circles is referred to as Earth observation. And it really just means measuring electromagnetic energy or light. And it can be used, we can measure that light in many different ways. It can be just measuring the reflected sunlight from a satellite, or it could be a more active sensor like LiDAR, or radar from an airplane. But what remote sensing is useful for is it can help us see at scales that we might not be able to see when we're out in the field. At a specific wetland site. This is the technology really that is used to help create maps. And it can allow us to map things through time going forward, but also reaching back into the time, into our historic archive of satellite imagery. And that alone can be really powerful to try and understand, what was the historical patterns of a wetland in the past. I see remote sensing as a useful data set that can be used to help create many different observations that can be used for monitoring and modeling into the future or to characterize wetlands in different ways. I think, remote sensing has really taken off. It's kind of become more and more of a thing as we get more satellites up there, more sensors, drones. And there's a lot more methods that go from very simple to, using your eyeballs to all the way to, statistical or artificial intelligence. But really, I kind of want to make this feel a little more accessible. Remote sensing, it really is just a set of tools that can be kind of a grab bag of using different sensors. And then there's, different kinds of methods from the simple to the complex. And then it can be used for more complex modeling. Maybe that's combining it with a data set that you collect on the ground, in situ data, and that uses, to train and model, ecosystem services or habitat or some sort of process in areas that you can't visit, across the landscape. So each of these different sensors that we might use in our toolkit has different, opportunities and limitations. And really it's centered around what I call kind of remote sensing resolution and extent, domains. And this is the spectral, temporal, and spatial resolution of a sensor. Each sensor is usually optimized for one of these. And so it's really kind of important when you're thinking about your specific question or decision, or issue that you want to look at using remote sensing, to think about what is the ideal resolution that you need. Of course, everyone wants the highest spectral, temporal, and spatial resolution, but usually sensors have different trade-offs. So we're just going to go through these quite quickly. The first is the spectral domain, the spectral resolution. And this is just simply the number of areas a sensor is measuring along that electromagnetic spectrum. So it could be just one part, like a black and white image is just picking up one reflected, part of the electromagnetic spectrum, or it could be, red or green or blue, or it could delve into things that, we can't see with our own eyes, like infrared, radar. And so just the more resolution we have, the more we can differentiate between things on the ground, like plant species or different features. So it's kind of important to have enough spectral resolution. The other one is the spatial domain. So that really covers spatial resolution. How fine of a resolution do you need to answer your question? Do you need to be able to count every tree, for example? Or is it okay, is it sufficient to look at the percent change in greenness of an area? And this relates usually to the size of the pixels of the imagery that comes from the different sensors. One of the common trade-offs with the spatial resolution is spatial extent. So for example, you may have a drone image that can give you really very high resolution data, but it only covers a limited spatial extent. Whereas, a satellite sensor like the Landsat satellite might have a lower spatial resolution with pixels at 30 meters, but it can cover half the state. So these are kind of the different trade-offs that I start thinking about when I think of what is the tools that I want to build into my remote sensing toolkit. The other one is the temporal domain. So to answer your question, what is the resolution that you need to detect the change? Does it have to be every day, or can it be every 16 days or every year? So that's what we call the temporal resolution. And again, it's different for every different sensor. This is often also a trade-off with the temporal extent. We have older satellites that can go back 40 years, but may not have the frequency of some of the newer satellites that might take daily imagery. So, these are all of the considerations that I think about when I'm trying to build in a remote sensing toolkit to answer a specific question. What is the necessary detail to see an observable impact? If I'm trying to monitor a change, how frequently do I have to monitor it? What is the spatial resolution that I have to detect that change? And then how much uncertainty is acceptable? I might be modeling something and I really want very low uncertainty. So that means I'm going to have to collect a lot more field data and have, higher resolution imagery to build better models. But really, again, it's a trade-off. Different sensors have different spatial, temporal, and spectral resolutions and extent. So is there a way that I can combine sensors to, kind of get the best of all worlds? And then last but not least, I just want to raise the point that, cost is also a really big consideration in remote sensing. A lot of the data is free, but a lot of it requires, purchase or a license to use, and this comes at a cost. But really, I think now a lot of the cost with remote sensing is the complexity of the methods that you use to apply to those data sets. So that's definitely a consideration. Is buying a high resolution air photo good enough if you can use your eyeballs to look at the change and be able to see what you need from the image? Maybe that's more cost effective than, using some crazy AI method that, requires hiring a really expensive, AI data scientist to build a fancy model. So these are kinds of, things that are in my head when I'm thinking about, what do I need to do to build this toolkit? I think too, the other thing is that wetlands are really challenging from a remote sensing standpoint. So I think it's important to realize these challenges up front. One of the challenges is that wetlands are really diverse. So one model or method may not work for all wetlands. There's a lot of diversity within the state, and that can be really hard to pick up in remote sensing without a lot of training data. Wetlands are really dynamic. So, if you're using temporal imagery, you may not be able to capture the dynamic nature in a way that you want. If you're looking at, annual aerial photos, it may not be able to detect, what is normal wetland dynamics and how is that different from something that might be, a land use change on the ground that's causing a different hydrological pattern. And then there's a lot of different hydrologic drivers of wetlands. So when we model wetlands, trying to get at some of the hydrology can be really challenging. We can model surface water flows, but that may only work for some wetlands. Other wetlands, we might need to have an understanding of groundwater. These are all kinds of considerations. And again, when we look at wetlands, especially for mapping wetlands, they can look really differently depending on the land cover and land use. And if it's been, in this example, if it's been harvested or not, if it's been altered in some way, it may be difficult to see these different kinds of wetlands in imagery. And sometimes the wetlands may be so radically changed that using imagery alone is just impossible because, they don't look like other wetlands. And in fact, they look more similar to other land cover types, like a pumpkin patch, for example. And then another, thing unique to remote sensing is that we have this tricky problem with shadows in aerial imagery, where shadows create dark objects in the image that can look like water. And sometimes when you're trying to train a computer to recognize wetlands, they see those shadows as wetlands, and that can be a real challenge. In addition, we have a lot of wetlands that are more ephemeral that we may not be able to see in the imagery at all because they're so ephemeral. They're either saturated soils, so they don't have standing water, or by the time that the air photo or satellite image is capturing that wetland, it has dried up. So again, a really tricky thing to consider. However, despite that, I think we now are at a place where we can use these different wetland sensors that are optimized for different spectral, temporal, and spatial resolutions and extents together using different methods to build a pretty robust wetland toolkit that can help us get at improved maps of wetlands, kind of creating a baseline that's spatially aligned that we can now layer on top other types of analyses that might help us characterize wetlands, monitor wetlands through time, and then use that data to be able to project them into the future. I also want to just recognize too that imagery is powerful in and of itself, and that oftentimes when I'm going through this process of helping different organizations or communities build their own wetland earth observation or remote sensing toolkit, that a lot of what comes out that's really important and powerful is just, being able to kind of collect the different stories and narratives and understanding of what's happening to wetlands at a landscape scale and through time. For example, going, gosh, I remember when we flooded these wetlands or these fields and it looked like this, and wow, I can see that in the imagery, and I think that was really important, and look what happened. You can see like how the vegetation might have changed later in the growing season, for example. So sometimes the conversations around this process of building this toolkit in and of itself is very valuable. Okay, so that was just a little bit of background to try and give folks an idea of how remote sensing can be useful, some of the challenges. And now I'm going to dig more deeply into talking about a specific tool called the Wetland Intrinsic Potential tool that I developed here with my co-authors listed here, especially Dan Miller from TerrainWorks, who did a lot of the heavy lifting. And also I want to acknowledge Amy Yahnke, who really helped develop this method in its many iterations. So the initial reason for the Wetland Intrinsic Potential tool, as Connor mentioned, was really to address this issue of wetland inventories, the national wetland inventory in particular, being that it's often out of date and it has high errors of omission. And this is especially true in forested and agriculture areas. This was initially tuned to identify forested wetlands, which are particularly difficult to see in aerial imagery. And there was, again, a lot of iterations funded by a lot of state and federal agencies. Really to get around this problem of improving the national wetland inventory and reducing those errors of omission, those wetlands that are missed in this national wetland inventory. So it's just an example in the whole watershed. The pink kind of polygons that you see here are the national wetland inventory. And you can see there's a mix of forest harvesting. There's also the Olympic National Park on the left, some roads. But when we zoom into some of these, areas of heavy tree canopy, it can be really difficult to identify the forested wetlands that are occurring below the canopy. There's a wetland right in the middle of this air photo here. It's kind of looking down from a bird's eye view. And this is just what that wetland looks like from the ground. So completely closed canopy. And throughout the whole watershed, there's a lot of these forested wetlands with closed or partial canopy, or that just don't have standing water, so they're difficult to see. So they essentially just got missed when the NWI was created. And again, because a lot of these areas are under some sort of active harvest, they can be difficult to detect in the imagery alone. So this approach really wanted to use additional variables, specifically terrain indices and hydrologic flow indices that occur below the canopy, and that we can use data sets like LiDAR that are active sensors that give us detailed terrain models, taking an active image of the landscape, essentially meaning that it provides its own source of light. That light can penetrate through the canopy and let us see what's happening below the canopy surface, providing really detailed terrain models like this one. This can be used to help us understand, the different landscape features where wetlands tend to be, as well as monitor or model the flow of water. And so with the Wetland Intrinsic Potential tool, again, this is a machine learning model, so it does kind of fall under that umbrella of artificial intelligence. But rather than having something that's super, black box, I wanted to take a step back and create more of a science-informed modeling approach that's kind of grounded in how do we identify wetlands on the ground, which is, with wetlands, as all of you know, is by looking for the hydrologic indicators, the hydric soils, and the hydric vegetation. And this can serve as foundation for identifying remote sensing proxies or data sets that can, fit those different categories. And so this is that exercise of thinking back, reaching back into my remote sensing toolkit and thinking, what are all the different sensors and methods and how might they fit into this framework, this wetland indicator framework that I created. So just kind of cycling through these different remote sensing proxies or modeled data inputs, a lot of them were derived from that digital terrain model from LiDAR. And, the hydrologic indicators model different hydrologic processes, like the topographic wetness index can be used to identify where surface water flows and is held. finding those really good depressional wetlands. Another one called the depth to water index can help serve as a proxy for groundwater fed wetlands by trying to interpolate the groundwater surface using different expressions of water across the landscape. And then this was kind of our big breakthrough, is realizing that there's a lot of different features that are common to wetlands that have different kind of curvatures, and depressions and slope. And there's lots of different indices we can use to kind of measure the different kinds of curvatures across the landscape. But really what was the key piece to all of this was realizing that, wetlands come in all shapes and sizes, and that actually these different terrain indices also can be calculated at different scales, from very small scales, looking for those small depressions, maybe a little hollow, to larger depressions that might be like a swale or a valley, and how kind of that nested features can really drives where wetlands, or is a good predictor of where wetlands can be. So we calculated these different terrain and hydrologic indices at different scales, looking for these different size features, and use this as inputs into our machine learning model. So the machine learning model generates these multi-scale terrain indices. We can bring in other remote sensing data sets like aerial imagery, tree height from LiDAR. We can bring in soils data. We can bring in geology. We build this into a model which initially is trained on whatever available data we have. In our case, it was the National Wetland Inventory. And that gives us, we use a random forest classifier, which gives us an output that is a continuous output of probability of how likely is a pixel going to be a wetland or a non-wetland or upland. In our case, we could kind of just keep it at that level. But what we did is we did an iterative approach, going back and then sampling along our initial probability output, and then improving the data set with new input training data set. So just quickly, this is what it looks like for the whole watershed. This is the example I showed earlier. The National Wetland Inventory, as you can see, it's really binary. We see these polygons of wetlands, but it's missing a lot of these cryptic, more hidden wetlands. I think the big point that I do want to make, and this is very, very important for anyone that's in Eastern Washington, is the National Wetland Inventory in some locations has just a little bit of misalignment, which when you're going out into the field may not be a problem, because you can see that the wetland doesn't quite match up what's on the ground, but that's okay because you're human and you can figure it out and work with it. But when we want to use the NWI with other remote sensing data sets that are more spatially aligned, that misalignment causes a huge headache and really limits our ability to build this Earth observation toolkit with other remote sensing data sets. So I just want to point out that the misalignment is actually kind of a big deal, and even more of a big deal in Eastern Washington, where we have more misalignment. So with this, again, just walking through this method with the whole watershed and creating a training data set, this is just points of wetland and non-wetland that we're using to train our computer to help us get at a better prediction of wetlands along the landscape, giving us a probability of how likely is a pixel to be a wetland or not, given all of those input data sets that we had stacked into our model as variables. This is our initial output, and then we further sampled across that, labeling these points as wetland and non-wetland or upland, and rerunning the model to get at a more refined data set at wetland probability. And this has worked pretty well at identifying these hidden wetlands that are missing in the NWI, because it's really looking at other features, not just the aerial imagery alone. And this is just some examples here. You can kind of see these, I guess on the upper left, here's just some wetlands here where kind of treed bogs, I guess, where there's a lot of stress, and you can see that in the yellowing, but they're not mapped by the NWI, but here we're doing a pretty good job at picking those out. So I will say that this method did improve the overall accuracy, and really it was improved from the NWI going from 84% to 92% because of the reduction in omission error, meaning it was mapping those cryptic wetlands much better than the NWI. What did come at a little cost of commission error, but the commission error, rather than being an absolute false positive, really was more related to just not getting the edges as correctly. So that's kind of the challenge with the wetland intrinsic potential tools. At the edges, you know, you have wetlands that might be hard to detect if they're a wetland or not on the ground anyway, and those are hard for the model as well. So I would say the error is a little different. So with this, we can get outputs to understand what were the biggest drivers of wetlands in those areas. And this can also be useful. And in this case, we can see that, you know, the terrain indices really were important variables in this model. And it's different wherever you run it. You can find out, like, maybe it's groundwater proxies that are more important indicators than others. Okay. This is now an ArcGIS toolbox. It's also a method. It's published. If you want to read the more detailed methods, I'm happy to share that with you. We're trying now to build it into an R package for those of you who are more coding savvy and want to do it that way. And I guess before, I'm just going to, you know, switch into some examples of how this can be used with other different remote sensing data sets. But I want to just kind of point out that this is a fundamentally different product than something like the NWI. And I don't necessarily see it as replacing the NWI, but more as a complement. You know, the NWI is really great in the sense that it is this real binary kind of, you know, vector polygon data set of kind of delineating the boundaries of a wetland, where the WIP tool is a probability, you know, from 0 to 100%. How likely is a pixel going to be a wetland? And so it picks out those kind of transition zones, those edges, it also can pick up areas that might be moist forest that might not quite meet the jurisdictional boundary or jurisdictional definition of a wetland. I guess this is important to point out for two reasons. One is, if you want to, you can put this through a segmentation algorithm and turn it into polygons if that is of use. But I see having a continuous representation of wetlands as being a big asset, because it allows for folks who want to model variables or ecosystem services as a continuous variable possible. And I'll get into some examples of that. So just kind of two very different kinds of data sets. I'm just going to kind of show you what it looks like when you compare it to the imagery. So this is what it looks like from an air photo. Again, you can see some of those areas stressed out, kind of the yellow areas, those treed bogs, and just how it's just a totally different data set. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up here on this last little bit, I'll try and go quickly. And Levi, please just interrupt me. I don't know how much time I have left.
Couple minutes.
Okay, I'll just kind of try to go quite quickly through this, just to kind of give this example of how this is, the wetland intrinsic potential tool really can be a strong foundation, but then there's other things you can layer on top of it to help get at some of those variables of a wetland that we may want to characterize or monitor through time, or even project into the future. And I really want to give a big plug for this because this is a project I'm just starting up with second phase funding from NASA through a model that I developed with my collaborators at the University of Washington, where we're using the wetland intrinsic potential tool to model above and below ground wetland carbon. And it turns out that the WIP tool output is a good predictor at predicting soil carbon. And so this is a project that we will be starting very shortly and scaling to the state for Washington State. So hope to have predictions of wetland carbon for the state in the next couple years. Other things that folks have done with this that I've worked on is use the wetland intrinsic potential tool to look at some different kinds of ecosystem services like water storage, and looking at the ability for areas that could be potential restoration sites for increasing water storage. Looking at areas incised channels or beaver mimicry. These are all questions that I've explored with the Tulalip tribes and others. So they're just kind of different questions that you can layer on top through either GIS analyses or other remote sensing data sets. Of course, you can now take and reach back through the Landsat archive to look at how wetlands have changed historically. So that's gonna talk about that in our next talk here. The wetland intrinsic potential tool can help be a way to help improve the kind of mapping extent of wetlands in place of the NWI, allowing us to look at, the hydrology of a wetland through time, going back 40 years. Oops, sorry about this. This is work that I did quite a while ago, but looks at the different kinds of hydrologic signatures through time, whether that wetland is more surface water driven, groundwater driven, trying to understand if it's gone through some significant change or not to changes in its hydrology. Using this in places like Yellowstone to predict wetland habitat for different species. Using, again, satellite image time series, looking at how wetland, the change in hydro period might be impacting species composition over time. Another project looking at the change in vegetation and water composition of different wetlands and meadows, trying to look specifically for this example with the National Park Service, looking at tree encroachment in wetlands and meadows. I just thought this was a really fascinating finding, is looking at certain subalpine meadows. You can start to see, through remote sensing, looking at the change in vegetation cover, identifying areas where there's significant tree encroachment. This is those kind of brown areas here that you can see. And the loss of the subalpine, which we're able to quantify. I'm not sure if this is applicable to the kinds of things that folks are looking at with this program, but I do want to point out that we can look beyond just water, just mapping, and look at different vegetation composition changes as well. And maybe, look across a larger landscape to understand, what might be the drivers of wildlife population decline. This was looking at, tree encroachment and then compiling it with marmot habitat for Olympic National Park and looking at areas where we see populations, disappearing and understanding if it might be driven by, tree encroachment. And then finally, I just kind of finishing up here, another piece was once we have kind of these robust time series, which we're going to talk about next, there's a lot we can do with it. We can look at changes through time, but we can also correlate it to climate data and then make projections into the future. This is just some work I did in my PhD looking at, changes in the hydro period with different climate scenarios in the future, and realizing that really we have, again, very complex and diverse wetlands across Washington State, which will likely have not just different changes in hydrology, but likely different directions in hydrology, with some wetlands getting wetter and some getting drier. Okay, that's it, Levi. Thank you so much. And I really want to just make the point to folks, I'm at the University of Washington. If you have questions about how to integrate remote sensing into anything that you do, please reach out. I'm always really curious to hear what are the questions that people are asking and how I might be able to build that into my, my research. So thank you.
Thank you, Meghan. That was very comprehensive, and I really appreciate also that you're highlighting sort of extensions and derivatives of this wetlands intrinsic potential tool, and just remote sensing in a general way too. I think folks in this program, outside of wetlands, there's habitat modeling, there's all kinds of potential applications of this approach. So thank you for that. In the interest of time, I want to make sure Matt and Jacob have enough time to kind of cover their topics. So let's hold questions for now, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end to wrap things up. And without further ado, turn it over to Jacob Taylor and Matt Stevenson.
Thanks, Levi. Jacob, would you like me to share screen, or would you prefer to do that?
You can do it if you want to go for it.
Yeah, let's do it. All right. Can everyone see a satellite above the Earth? Excellent. Okay, yeah. So great. Jacob and I are going to have a couple of handoffs in the middle of our talk, and we are going to be describing to you how we did wetland monitoring using spectral unmixing with Landsat imagery. And we're in the slightly awkward position of having to explain a methodology that was developed by none other than Meghan Halabisky. Meghan, I apologize in advance if I botch the explanation for any of these methods that you pioneered. So please feel free to interrupt and correct me if I mischaracterize anything that you did. All right. So what is spectral unmixing? Well, it's a useful method, as Meghan alluded to, for tracking changes to wetlands and provides some temporal detail through time to monitor seasonal and long-term changes in wetland hydrology. And I decided to just use a quote from her paper, so hopefully this gives you a sense of what this thing does. And then I'm going to try to relate it in terms that are possibly more intuitive for those of you who are coming to this for the first time. So spectral mixture analysis, or SMA, is a physically based technique which can be used to estimate the percent cover of surface water without the need for extensive training data. SMA estimates the fractional abundance of spectra, that's the really important part there, representing physically meaningful materials known as spectral end members, don't worry, I'll unpack that later, which comprise a mixed pixel, thus providing sub-pixel estimates of surface water extent. That's what this thing does. There's a link to her paper, which has a ton of detailed descriptions of how all of that stuff works. So the reason this is helpful is because typically, again, as Meghan was referring to, a thing is either a wetland or it's not a wetland. It's sort of a binary characterization. It's an all or nothing approach. And this usually during the land cover classification happens at a per pixel level. The thing is, Landsat has a 30-meter resolution. That's a pretty chunky pixel. And therefore, the typical Landsat pixel is composed of a wide variety of cover types, which have various levels of saturation. So wetlands in particular, as you all know, are frequently a mix of emergent vegetation, shrubs, tree canopy, open water, and they're usually interdigitated really close together. So to illustrate this, this is a set of resolutions to scale for Landsat, the giant green pixel, Sentinel-2, the blue pixel, and then LiDAR, the red pixel. So my house is about 30 feet on a side. It looks kind of like a Monopoly house. And it's a little bit smaller than the 10-meter pixel. And my lot has a slightly different configuration, but it's a little bit smaller than the Landsat pixel. So if you can imagine your house or your apartment building or wherever you live and the lot that it's on, you know that there's a roof, there's probably some trees, maybe a little bit of grass, we've got a walkway, we've got a gravel parking pad. All of that is within that single 30-meter Landsat pixel. So the really remarkable innovation with this method that Meghan developed is they essentially figured out how to unbake a cake. So a cake is made of flour, sugar, water, eggs, etc., just like a Landsat pixel is made up of trees, grass, water, rocks, etc. They're using these things called end members, which are essentially a spectral profile of the different classes that you're interested in. So what you're looking at in these 4 little graphics here are the band numbers. So in this particular analysis, I believe this was all done with Landsat 5. There were 7 bands that were available. I believe she did not use the thermal band, which would be band 6. So along the bottom, you see the different bands that are available. And then the y-axis is the intensity of reflectance for each of those bands. And you can see that the profile, the spectral profile of salt, wetland vegetation, sage or shrub steppe, and water are really, really different. And you can do this for each pixel so you know roughly what the composition is of the different classes or end members that you're interested in. So Jacob and I worked really collaboratively on this analysis. And I want to emphasize what Meghan said earlier, that if you reach out to her, she's interested in helping and sharing her methodology. So she and her consultant, Jesse Anderson, shared their code base that they developed in Google Earth Engine for an area in Eastern Oregon. And the task that Jacob and I were faced with was to translate that to the specific situation of Spokane County. We had to develop end members, and because Jacob is a lot more familiar with conditions on the ground, he took on that task. So what you're seeing in cyan in this map are the locations of the end members that he digitized for us. Mud, vegetated agriculture, dry vegetation, tree vegetation, wet vegetation, and open water. And to illustrate what some of those end members look like, we've got a couple of examples of wet vegetation on the left and agricultural vegetation on the right. I converted those to GeoJSON format that could easily be added to the Google Earth Engine code. And if you've never seen Earth Engine, this is what it looks like. I will briefly describe what Earth Engine is if you've never heard of it. The good folks at Google, being Google, thought it would be cool if they got every satellite image, aerial photo, pretty much ever made by humans and put it on the cloud. And then they developed a programming interface to allow you to write just a few lines of code to manipulate that imagery. It's totally amazing. It's so much faster than the old way of doing things where you'd have to download individual scenes, process them, stitch them together, and then you could run your code. So here you're bringing your code to the data rather than bringing your data to the code. So we adapted their code base using the end members that Jacob digitized, and we came up with an estimate of the maximum surface water, which was just one of the outputs. And this is the first time that I will hand it over to Jacob, and he's going to give a rundown of these outputs and then explain what we did with them from here.
Yeah, so like Matt said, this is a list of all the outputs that this model can give us. And so we did an analysis this year, and we looked specifically at number 6, that annual maximum surface water extent. And I just wanted to kind of put this list in front of you for the first time now, and then we'll come back to this at the end when we start talking about next steps. But we can jump forward to the next slide, and I'll just kind of talk about what we did for our analysis this year. And so the first thing we had to do was define our wetland extents. And Meghan actually touched on this in her presentation about using NWI and how it can be kind of problematic with the high emission rates. And we'll come back to that again at the end of this presentation as well, about how we're looking at improving upon this in the future. But we used NWI, and we actually added a 30-meter buffer to those NWI polygons to account for some of those omissions and some of those offsets, which I can attest to that. That's a real thing, especially on the riverine stuff over here on the east side. But then the next thing we had to do, looking at the figure on the right there, oh, go back one. just real quick, we had to define our study areas. So obviously this is VSP and we're looking at watershed scale and we're looking at agricultural land. So our study areas in Spokane County, we have 5 major watersheds. And then what the model does is it outputs basically a hydrograph. And so we developed actually 2 hydrographs for each watershed we looked at. One looking at the maximum surface water extents for all the wetlands within the entire watershed. And then another one looking at those wetland extents only on the agricultural land within that watershed. And then we can go forward to the next slide and look at this is what our outputs look like, what those hydrographs look like. And I've got a slide here for each watershed we looked at, and we can kind of cruise through these, but I'll walk you through what we're looking at here. So like I said, we have 2 hydrographs on the left there. The one on the top is just looking at the surface area of wetlands on the ag lands within that watershed. We're looking at Palouse here. And then the bottom one is looking at all the wetlands across the whole watershed. And so we have those surface areas on the y-axis in square meters. And then obviously we have time across the x-axis from 1984 to 2022. And so what we were trying to do is compare, again, those ag lands to the whole watershed and look at differences in those trend lines between the agricultural wetlands and the whole watershed. So we did a simple linear regression, and that's what you're looking at on the right there, with agricultural intersects on the Y and whole watershed on the X. And then we're looking for our R-squared value to look at how similar those 2 data sets are, with obviously the high R-squared value close to 1, indicating that they're very similar or not different. And so for Palouse, we had a 0.98 R-squared value. That was one of the higher ones. And let's see, let's go to the next slide. Here's Lower Spokane. Had a little more variation in the data on this one. Still a pretty high R-squared value, above 0.95. One other thing worth pointing out here is we did have a gap in our data there at 2011 that everybody always asks me about. And that was the switchover from Landsat 5 to Landsat 8. There was actually a year of missing data before Landsat 8 came online. So that we ran into that missing data for every watershed we looked at. Let's see, next slide. Here's Little Spokane with a 0.96 R-squared value. And this one, it was worth noting that this every watershed we looked at had an increasing or a positive trend over time. And this is one of the steepest slopes, or the most positive trends we saw was on the Little Spokane watershed. And then I think the second most was the next one, Hangman, if you want to go to the next slide. And so that did kind of pique our interest, that positive trend. That's something we'd like to maybe dig into a little more in the future. But Matt actually looked into some historic precipitation data, which is shown on the next slide, just to kind of compare. And, we did find that positive trend for Spokane County precipitation data over that same time frame. So that kind of matches up. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Matt.
No, just that the time scale doesn't match exactly. This goes backwards in time a little bit farther than our analysis, but it was reassuring to see that a secondary data source was showing the same upwards trend over time.
And then next slide. And this is actually where I hand it back over to Matt, but this was the last watershed middle Spokane, and we did have kind of an anomaly in the data there, that downward spike in 2010 that Matt did some investigation.
Yeah, this one definitely caught our attention because the bottom falls out in 2010 in this watershed during a year when the blue line here in the bottom graph, which is annual precipitation from PRISM data, is high. So we thought, well, that's kind of weird. Why is this happening? So we went back into the data and had a look at the maximum or peak surface water extent for 2010 and then for a year on either side. So from left to right, we're looking at 2009, 2010, and 2011. And in 2010, you've probably already spotted the difference. There are a couple of very large water bodies to the north and south of the Spokane River that are missing data. And to verify this, we extracted a data quality layer from Earth Engine, which Jesse shared code with me to do, which was very helpful. And this shows the number of valid records by year. And valid means that there's usable data. So the land hasn't been masked by clouds or smoke, or there isn't some other like sensor problem that would prevent you from doing analysis with that scene. So in 2009, the way the scale works is the red, orange, and yellow range from 1 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. And then as you get into greens, which actually aren't visible on this map, you have even more valid records for that year. In 2010, you only get a few chances for the satellite to get a clean image. As Meghan was alluding to, I believe the return interval is something like 14 to 16 days for Landsat. And this one particular year, it just got skunked in this portion of the county, and there was not any valid imagery for this portion of this one watershed. So that's something to note and be cognizant of if you are going to adapt this method to your own VSP jurisdiction. And then we wanted to get an understanding of how accurate or not this method was for estimating wetland extent. So we used RStudio to create a spatially balanced set of 100 wetlands. We used unequal inclusion probabilities to select wetlands within that spatially balanced sample. And the inclusion probabilities were determined by the size of the wetland. The reason we did that is there are thousands and thousands of teeny tiny wetlands scattered throughout the NWI data for Spokane County, but the vast majority of the totals are coming from those larger wetlands and water bodies, and we wanted to be sure that we were including a fair number of those within our stratified sample. And the way that we checked this, the way that we verified it, was to take the 30-meter buffer that Jacob referenced around all of the NWI polygons and then create a true color composite from the Sentinel-2 imagery. That was the one that I showed the 10-meter resolution pixel for. The reason we used Sentinel instead of NAIP is that Sentinel has a very rapid return interval. I think it's about 4 or 5 days in this part of the world. And the resolution was close enough that we were willing to be able to match the earlier part of our analytical window with the full extent of water. In other words, NAPE is flown later in the summer, at which point many of the ephemeral wetlands that are common in Spokane County are long gone. So we were trying to match a visual imagery with when the Landsat data was showing us where the water was. So I digitized by hand for each of those stratified sampled wetlands the extent of surface water, which you see in red. And then we summarized the percent inundated, which you're seeing in that continuous blue scale within the red and green polygons. And I summarized all of that information and sent it to Jacob, and I'm going to hand it back to him to explain the results.
Yeah, and then again, we just did another simple linear regression, comparing our model outputs to that digitized surface area for those 100 randomly selected wetlands. And again, we're looking at that R squared value, and we came up with a 0.9946, indicating that our model is pretty spot on with what we were digitizing. So that's what we did for our accuracy assessment. If you want to go to the next slide, we do have some ideas for improving the accuracy further, and we kind of alluded to this earlier, and I know Meghan talked about it too, but we do have plans to develop the WIP tool for Spokane County. Hopefully this January. We're waiting for a new LiDAR data set that is supposed to come out this winter, and will give us full countywide coverage of high resolution, 1.5 foot resolution LiDAR data for the county. And so we'll start working on that this winter and next spring and summer, and hopefully be able to use that to kind of replace NWI, and with a more accurate representation of wetlands across the county to use as our maximum extent to run the model with. And then on top of that, we acknowledge that we haven't done any actual field verification associated with this model. We did our accuracy assessment using just digitization using aerial imagery, but we will be doing field verification, especially when we start developing the WIP model, but we can also use that to validate this Landsat model. And I have some ideas for that as well. And actually, maybe I should talk to Connor a little bit about getting my hands on some data, but I have some ideas about using some wetland delineation data for some validation as well. And especially if we can get historic data, going back in time, and we can compare it to our model outputs, from the early 2000s or 90s or before, that would be great. Yeah, that's kind of the next steps as far as improving the model. And then if you want to go to the next slide, and kind of back to this outputs, this list of outputs, and starting to think about what we can do moving forward. And I guess just full disclosure here, from this point on, we're kind of in brainstorming mode. So we're figuring this out as we go a little bit here, but just looking at this list of outputs, we've got things like length of inundation, annual deviation from the norm on that inundation. And then we have our surface water extents, our minimum and our maximum, as well as the dates of those minimum and maximums. And then we have NDVI, looking at greenness or vegetation as well. And so just think about what kind of questions we can ask with this kind of data. If you want to go to the next slide. So just some exploratory questions. So we looked at maximum annual surface water extents, but we would like to look at the minimum extents as well and see if those are trending, if those trend lines are increasing at the same rate as the maximum. And then also, like I said, look at the dates of those minimum and maximums. And, are they shifting one direction or the other? Are they getting closer together or farther apart? And what does that mean for things like water storage and low season flows, as well as things like habitat, hydro periods? Are those seasonally inundated areas getting smaller or bigger? And what does that mean for habitat or denitrification or things like that? And then another cool thing that we can use this model for is wetland classification. And so we can use the model to, the obvious one is binning wetlands into different categories like seasonal or permanent. And then we can run the model looking at those different categories of wetlands and looking at, are the ephemeral wetlands growing or shrinking over time, or are the seasonal wetlands, growing or shrinking over time, or vice versa. And then vegetation, I said NDVI, and Meghan was talking about some work she's doing with vegetation and carbon sequestration, and that's something we'd like to look into moving forward as well. And then this is actually out of Meghan's paper, back to that wetland classification, different ways you can call out different kinds of wetlands, like the shrinking wetland. Is that hydrograph, the trend line decreasing at a faster rate than everything else around it, or everything within the watershed, or whatever study area you're looking at. Same with the created wetland, if it, that sudden spike, or even just a gradual increase, if it's changing at a different rate than the rest of the wetlands around it, then it might be worth looking into. And then the tilled wetland, obviously, has that sporadic kind of hydrology that's kind of indicative of anthropogenic influences. And so, yeah, I think we've just kind of hit the tip of the iceberg on what we can do with this stuff, and looking forward to playing with it some more. I think that's the last slide.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jacob and Matt. That was wonderful follow-up, I think, to Meghan's presentation as well, to kind of extend how some of these tools can be used in the context of VSP, and really appreciate your presentation there.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have a little bit of time for open discussion. I know I've been kind of, there hasn't been a ton of space for questions. So I'm wondering, it's been a pretty dense day because there's like quite a bit of information. I have a couple of kind of highlights that I thought about mentioning, but I think I've been talking a lot. So I want to just step back for a minute and see if folks have any questions, or thinking about maybe applying some of these tools to your own county, and what kind of bridges or barriers you might encounter to do that, and so on. So I'll just take a minute here and see if, don't be shy, raise your hand, or just, Grant, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Grant. I'm with the Walla Walla County Conservation District, and always jealous of some of the cool stuff that Spokane is doing. I did have a question just to kind of tease out for our county, and thinking about our own VSP, kind of the differences between the work that I know that Meghan is kind of behind both of them, but kind of the code that you all were using with Landsat versus what Meghan was presenting on with the WIP. And is it right to say that with the Landsat one, that would not probably get as much to like forested or covered wetlands because it doesn't use LiDAR or anything like that? Or have you all found that it still works out pretty well for that?
Matt, you might add, or Meghan, you might add to this too, but I know we've had issue, we have less unmasked pixels up in that forested northeast corner of our county. Did you have something to add to that, Meghan?
Oh, I was just going to agree with you, Grant. Yep, it's Landsat, any of those satellites that are passive sensors that are picking up the spectral data that is reflected sunlight is going to be really challenging for forested areas. So you got to do something else. But LiDAR is an active sensor. That's a great tool. It just isn't flowing that frequently. So that's the challenge with using it for monitoring.
And I would just say
Awesome.
that,
Yeah. Thank
Sorry,
you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, in an ideal world, we would have done the WIP first in Spokane County and then used the Landsat spectral mixture analysis, because probably there are some of those cryptic wetlands that we didn't measure because we were using the wrong boundaries. But as we get the WIP, then we'll have a better idea of what we're dealing with, I think.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. It's actually my first time hearing of the Landsat one, so that's really interesting, especially with the LiDAR issues like you all mentioned. So thank you.
And just for another like editorial note here, my understanding is we're supposed to be having, we should have statewide LiDAR coverage, I think, in the next couple years. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but that's I know that the dates are kind of fluid sometimes, but I think in a general sense, we should at least have, even if it's historic coverage, I think that's still better than nothing. And so I think we should have statewide coverage in the next couple of years. So this should, if you're in a county where you don't currently have LiDAR for your whole county, I think you probably will have it in the not too distant future. So just wanted to mention that. Any other questions out there? I'm curious if any other counties or anybody who's online have attempted to use the WIP or apply any of these other like remote sensing tools or even field-based assessments for like BSP monitoring or something like that.
Sorry, I'll just
Go ahead,
jump
Grant.
in again. We have not tried the WIP because of the LiDAR issue. The Landsat one's kind of interesting, so I think I'll look more into that. All we've really done is go out into the field and see if there's a wetland where it says there's one, so which is sometimes very hard.
I just want to take a moment to see if I can kind of tie the themes together too, so that there's a little bit of like I don't know, some concluding thoughts, I guess, that all kind of fit together. So I just want to back up to when we first started today. Rick was talking about sort of the context of VSP and monitoring and how important it is to have a baseline in which to compare things to, because in the statute, that's sort of, it's all about that, right? It's like, what were the functions and values of critical areas in 2011, and then how are they now in relation to agricultural activities, right? And it's been hard for groups to have a baseline, because if the National Wetlands Inventory is your baseline, we know that it's not perfectly accurate, right? So some of these remote sensing tools might be a way that we can look back in time. It's not going to be perfect, they're all models. Obviously, we can't go back in time and do a field assessment, at least not yet. I don't know of a time machine yet, although maybe in our lifetime. So yeah, who knows? So then if you're thinking about the field-based assessments, Rachel Maggi from NRCS talked about some of the assessment tools that they have on that VOTOG website, which is in the chat. A link is there. And her advice was, don't use the TechNote 14 right out of the box, but think about ways to contextualize it. The kind of what's your question is appropriate there, and then thinking about how that assessment fits into your question. And then she also showed you some resources for some additional, not necessarily wetland specific assessments, but like water quality assessments and other ag oriented assessments that might like speak to some of the challenges that you're having in your county or some of the potential pressures for wetlands. Amy demonstrated from Ecology the wetlands rating system and how it actually, in a lot of cases, does directly measure functions or indicators of functions. It looks at things at multiple scales, the scale of the wetland, the landscape context. There are trainings available through her program. I think there are potential ways to maybe think about linking up some of those field-based approaches that Rachel and Amy has mentioned with some of the remote sensing stuff that folks are talking about, because there is still a need to validate what the models are demonstrating. And I think important, I guess, on the functions and values piece, it's kind of cool to think about that some of these new spatial tools can actually get at some of those questions, like you saw with Jacob and Matt's presentation on like the wetted area of a wetland can kind of give you an indication of a function, right? And then also the other piece too that I think is really critical that we hear a lot too in the monitoring world in BSP is, how do we know if we're seeing a reduction in something, a decrease in a function? How do we know that that is decrease is associated with agricultural activities versus climate change? And so I was really interested, Meghan, when you brought up the applicability of some of your models for looking at some of that too, and projecting what you would expect a wetland to the behavior to be over time in relation to climate change. That might be really important contextual information for folks out there in BSP who are trying to disentangle what is driving the changes, right? And then knowing, like what Connor presented, that there's, you know, a fair amount of work's already gone into inventorying who's been surveying wetlands in what way. If you feel like in your county you don't have data that is workable for you, you're not alone, because the majority of people in that survey also said the same thing. The majority of those people also said that they use NWI the most, even though it is still not meeting their needs. And so I think it just highlights the need for these kinds of tools and to kind of operationalize some of these approaches. And knowing that we have a really super great community of researchers, practitioners here in this meeting that are willing to work with us and answer questions and stuff, I feel like that's super encouraging. So also wanted to just say thank you to the folks who presented today. Thanks for all the work that you've done, you know, that you've summarized in 20 minutes, but obviously took hundreds of hours probably to do, or thousands in some cases. So thanks for being there and sharing all that stuff. Thanks for being willing to work with folks kind of one-on-one or in groups to help develop some of these tools. And I hope that we can continue doing that moving forward to sort of create custom menus that make sense for folks who need to apply this stuff in a governance setting. So that's kind of my little wrap up there. We still have a few minutes in case anybody else has any burning desires or any follow-up questions or comments.
I'll just throw something out there real quick, Levi. I've also worked with the WIP tool quite a bit. So if anyone has questions on utilizing that or running its roadblocks, feel free to reach out to me as well. If you're having trouble tracking down Meghan, she can be a busy one running around as well. But yeah, happy to do that. And if our grant that we applied for gets awarded, we will be creating a WIP technical working group, where the aim of that is to get people together who want to apply the WIP, are interested in it, who are currently using it, and, you know, create kind of a brain vault there to answer questions, update methods, that sort of thing. So keep an eye out for that. We'll be announcing that if and when that happens, hopefully soon.
Awesome. Thank you, Connor. Any other final parting thoughts? Megan says in the chat, yes, Connor is amazing. I meant to thank him for really furthering the application of the WIP. So thank you, Connor. A little extra thanks there. Cool. Well, thank you all. I sure appreciate you all. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming out today, and stay tuned. I imagine there'll probably be some follow-up emails and communications around some of these issues. And then I guess the other piece, I don't have anything new to really add, but just planting seeds again or trying to maintain the seeds. The commission did get funding for a science hub, and part of the goal of science hubs is to do this kind of stuff more, have more of these conversations, share more of these tools, develop more of this stuff at the interface of ecosystems and agriculture. So I hope to see you all in the context of that too as that develops. And with that, have a great afternoon, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Levi. This was awesome.
Yeah,
Really appreciate it.
Levi. Thanks to all the other presenters too.
Thanks, everyone.